This is an interview with Dr. Rodger Kent Scott in San Francisco on September 29th, 2019. It's in the form of 10 questions which cover the spectrum of his life, hopefully. Question number 1, Dr. Scott. Born in Aspermont, Texas, youngest of the 9 surviving children, August 30th, 1936. What are some of your most prominent memories from those early years?
Well, again, one memory that's still in my mind, and again, I don't think it's from the original memory, but having reflected back on it many years, over the years. I was 3 years old when my mother and my older brother, Bernard, the family called him Buster, and many of us called him Slick. Mother took Slick and me out to visit. That'll pick up that sound of screw. Yeah. Mother took Slick and me out to visit friends on a ranch, I think maybe a couple of miles from town, and the three of us walked out there. And when we turned off the road into their place, there's a cattle guard, and I'd never been across a cattle guard before, I think, so I got down and walked on my all fours across it. And I remember that, and one of the most interesting experiences of my childhood in Aspermont was when I was 6 years old. I'm not quite sure why I hated school so much, but I never liked school till I got to college. But I think one of the reasons I disliked school so much was that my mother was very indulgent, and she was always, she rarely corrected me, and I think she might have spanked me once in my lifetime. And my sister Billy had taught me, she was 12 years older, and I remember she had taught me how to spell words that I had on 4th grade spelling test. 2 that I recall are Candy and Town, and she was a very loving teacher, and so I associated learning with what I learned from my brother and my sister Billy. And I found teachers very authoritarian and not very affectionate, and I didn't like being in an institution 6 hours a day, or ever how many hours we went. I think it was around 6 hours a day. And I had the great opportunity that first year of school. A man who had an airplane, an old biplane, open cockpit, that he flew and landed in a meadow at Lynx Dairy, and I was intrigued by airplanes, and my 2 older brothers were both they were both crewmen on airplanes in the Second World War. That would have been 1942 when I was in the 1st grade, and so I would, instead of going to school, I would go out to the Lynx Dairy, and I would be standing around watching the pilot, and it was early in the morning. I think he would take people up for $1 for the 10-minute flight. And I remember the first time I went, he and a woman, a very attractive woman, were there. She was dressed in a leather jacket and leather helmet and goggles, and she had gabardine trousers, very elegantly dressed, and boots that came up almost to her knees. And I was, as I said, 6 years old, and I had striped coveralls, and I was already wearing glasses. And so he saw this little tow-headed kid, watching him from about a 30-40 yard distance, and so he came over to me and he said, "Boy, would you like to go up with us?" And I said, "Sure." And so she got in, and then he he had me sit in her lap, and he put the seatbelt over both of us. And I think he thought it would be fun to scare me. And so he would fly upside down and he would do dives and spins. And of course I didn't have enough sense of life to be scared. I loved it. And
Was it his wife or a customer?
Neither, I think. I think it was a lady friend. And it was interesting. I remember smelling her perfume, and I don't remember it happening the first flight, but the second flight. In fact, I went there several days that week, and he kept taking me up each time. And on the second flight, I could tell he was drinking something from looked like a fifth of, I think, turned out to be a fifth of bourbon that he was drinking as he was flying. And I remember such a great experience. That was the most exciting thing that I'd ever done in life. And the fact, and I did it instead of going to school. I missed most of the days that week of school. And he took me up at least, I believe, 4 times. Not exactly sure if it's 3 or 4. When later somebody went into the store where my dad worked, right across from the courthouse lawn, and said, "How come you let your boy go up that pilot?" And he said, "What pilot?" And he, of course, he knew about the airplane. He didn't go up that time, but he'd gone up with, he'd flown, taken a short flight a few years before with Wiley Post, the man who was the pilot of the airplane that crashed, killing him and
Will Rodgers.
Will Rodgers, yeah. So he was surprised about that, and said that he and my mother hadn't given me permission to do it. In fact, he asked me about it, and that nobody threatened to punish me because it was about 2 weeks after the incident.
Speaking about W.R. Scott, what did he do to support the family?
Well, he'd been a farmer and a rancher from his early adulthood until 1934 was the last year he farmed. They were also, Mother and Dad and Delbert went to New Mexico in 1917.
Your oldest brother?
Yeah, my oldest brother Delbert, and the second brother Don was born that same year, and they were homesteading around Lakewood, New Mexico. They were there 3 years, and very much harder times than during the Depression. My dad said there was no rain in that 3-year period, and in one case there was water holes, water sources were so scarce that one brother poisoned his younger brother, put strychnine in his molasses and to kill him in order to avoid sharing a water hole with him. And some of those same people wanted to drive off the homesteaders, and so my dad said that they would rope the steers and jerk their horns off, and they would burn pastures to drive them out. And so after 3 years of those terribly hard times, then they moved to Stonewall County. Uncle Fletch, my dad's uncle on his mother's side, was the deputy sheriff of Peacock, Texas, and a prominent farmer and rancher there. And when they first moved there, they had the 2 little boys, Delbert and Don. They lived in a tent on Uncle Fletch and Aunt Maggie's place, and then they were sharecroppers on farms and ranches in that area. But then in '34, during the Depression, they had to move into Ashtamont 2 years before I was born. And in the 30s, my dad worked. He didn't have any experience. He was a good carpenter, but he had no experience as a civil engineer. But he had good people skills, so they would put him in charge of WPA road and bridge construction gangs. And one of the stories he tells about that was they were building a bridge across the Salt Fork of the Brazos River, in around 1935, I believe it was. And he said their plan was to start the span from one side of the river, build out as far as they could, and then they'd go the opposite side and start a span from that side and get them, have the two spans converge in the middle of the river. And they would finish the project that way. And the state engineer said, "Scott, I need to talk to you." And my dad said, "Well, what's the problem?" And he said, "Well, we need to speed up the project some." And my dad said, "Well, what do you have in mind?" And he said, "Well, instead of building two spans, it's faster if we just build one span all the way across the river. And what we need to do is to have two men plant a boom in the river to support the span." And my dad said, "Well, don't you think that's kind of dangerous?" And he said, "Well, hell, Scott, danger is part of the job." And my dad said, "Well, he said they were making $1 and a nickel a day, $21 a month." And he said that wasn't exactly hazardous pay. So he said to the state engineer, "Well, you don't think it's too dangerous?" And he said, "Oh no." So my dad said, "Well, would you be willing to be one of the two men to go down and plant the boom?" And the man said, "No, of course not." So my dad said, "Well, if it's too dangerous for the bosses, it's too dangerous for the workers." And I asked him what happened. He said, we built it the slower way and nobody got hurt. So he also drove a bookmobile at one point there, and he was a pretty good carpenter. Both his dad and my mother's dad were much more accomplished carpenters. But he learned and he worked as a carpenter, some in Aspermont and some in Lubbock after we moved. But he also worked for many years in A.L. Lawrence Grocery across from the courthouse in the town square of Aspermont. And we moved from Aspermont to Lubbock in 1944.
Tell us that story about the doctor that killed the other doctor.
Well, there were two doctors, Dr. Dodd and Dr. Wiley, and I'm not sure I have straight which one killed the other, but they were, one of them was very jealous of the other doctor. He was, the one doctor was more highly regarded than the other. In fact, once when Slick mistakenly took rat poisoning, he ate it, and when he was about 3 years old or so. And so my dad told Jiggs to go in and get the one doctor, and if he wasn't there, to get the other one. And so the one that they preferred wasn't there. I don't know if that was Dr. Dodd or Dr. Wiley. I should know my history better. And so then he went to the other one, and Jiggs was 13 at the time. He's the third brother in the family. And so Jiggs was, he knew a little bit about that rivalry, and the doctor who was there said, "Which doctor did your parents say to get?" And Jiggs, at the age of 13, knew how to answer that. He said, "Well, they said, go get a doctor, the first one I could find." And so he went out and gave him the medication, the antidote to the rat poisoning, and he survived okay.
And what about Sheriff Bailey Bingham? Wasn't he a cousin or something like that?
He was my dad's cousin. I don't remember ever meeting him, but my dad said he was a very effective and honest lawman. And he would have been my second cousin, but he no longer lived there after I was born in 36. I don't know if he died there or moved someplace else.
You've got a somewhat sad story about the little dog called Moonshine or something like that.
Yeah, the dog, that was Deb's dog, and I think he was around 10 years old when this happened, and still...
The dog or Deb was?
Deb was around 10 years old, and Moonshine was a little black and white female. And one of the neighbors, Shorty Sherrod, I think was his name, came over and complained that the little dog was sucking eggs in their hen house. They were in the adjoining farm and ranch. And so my dad said, "Deb, told Deb to keep the little dog away, and Deb thought that he'd done it successfully, but Shorty and another man came over one day and they said, "Dick, the little dog's still getting under her hen house and sucking eggs." And so Deb told me the story. I didn't get to ever ask my dad about this because I didn't learn about the story until after he died. And he said that Dad put a rope around Moonshine's neck and led her away.
What about Grandma? What about your mother? What would you like to say about her?
Well, she was many things. She was 42 when I was born, and my dad was 43, so a lot of people thought they were my grandparents. And it used to, I didn't realize what kind of people they were till I was grown. And, we lived in a poor part of town, and they were, my mother was, they went to school for 8 years in a one-room schoolhouse in Comanche County. And I understand that she was the best in reading and English in the school, not tough competition necessarily. And he was the best in algebra and history. In fact, one time when he came out to a faculty party here in San Francisco, I introduced him to the group of teachers and said, "This is my dad. He has an 8th grade education. He's probably the smartest person in this room." And when we got home, he said, "Well, what you said wasn't quite accurate." I thought he was going to say that I shouldn't have given him that compliment, saying he was the smartest person in the room probably. But he said, "You said I had an 8th grade education, and that's not quite true. Your mother and I went to school for 8 years." And he said, "I never learned what a verb was in the 8 years I went to school, but in algebra and history I was 10th grade. Mother was, she could do things so quickly. She could milk about 2 or 3 times as fast as my dad, so she would do all the milking. And I remember as a kid, I used to like to take a cup out to the cow lot with her, and she would squirt me a cup full of warm milk, which tasted really good. And then the cats would follow us, and she could squirt the cats. She would squirt milk to the cat's mouth about 6 or 8 feet away. So the cats liked that ritual. She also could write letters. She could write a 10 or 12 page letter in about that many minutes. She would use intelligent abbreviations. In fact, once when I was out of the country, I think I was studying in Mexico in the summer, and she sent a letter to me saying, "The B on your car is down." And anybody would know she meant battery. By the way, that's the same summer that my nephew Dane was playing on. I had a 41 Ford convertible that my brother Deb had given me in perfect shape. That was in 1956, so I was 14 years old at the time. And Dane was playing on top of the car and fell through the canvas top. So when I got back, my brother-in-law Wendell had put a new top on the car. And Mother was always, it's interesting, she was very gentle in some ways, like a lady, but if somebody bothered one of her children, she would really criticize people in a very harsh but justifiable way. Like her oldest brother, Marion, came to visit us one time, and I was always a little bit, he never smiled much, and he was, when he was young, he'd been really tough. My dad said he beat up the two of the toughest brothers, Clark brothers, in Comanche County one time. But I never felt very comfortable around him, and he and my dad were working out in the yard spading up the yard for a garden, and they were using a spade and a grubbing hoe. And so I remember going outside and playing in that area, and Uncle Marion looked at me and didn't smile, and he said, "If you don't stay out of the way, I'm going to use this grubbing hoe on you." And that really scared me. And so I went inside, and Mother said, "Why aren't you outside playing?" And I said, "I just wanted to come in." And she said, "No, did something happen?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Yes, it did. You told me what happened." And when I told her, she went out there and said, and she'd always been afraid of him because he drank a lot when he was a late teenager, and he would even, he had threatened the other members of the family. In fact, he was drunk one time and he chased Grandpa Butler around the kitchen with a butcher knife. So Mother was always kind of afraid of him, but she went out to him that day and said, he just told me what you said, and you don't say something like that to a child who doesn't know you're joking." And she said, "You better not ever say something like that to him or any other child who doesn't know you're joking. If you do, you'll certainly hear from me." And she also, I would describe her as a feminist for her time, because she always wanted her own income. She said to me once, your dad is generous and fair, but it's demeaning for any adult to ever have to ask another adult for money." So she wanted, when I was 14, that would have made her 56. She said once that she'd done a lot of nursing as a mother and neighbor, and so she wanted to do nursing and be paid for it. And she wanted her own income, of course. And so she started working as a nurse's aide, they called it at that time. And then later, I don't think she took any regular college courses, but I do think she had to take some workshops, maybe at Texas Tech. And then she became an LVN and worked until she was 70 as an LVN.
Can you remember when the family found out about Don?
Yeah, I was 8 years old, and
how did they find out? Telegram?
Yeah, somebody took a telegram from the telegraph office. They walked over to the grocery store, A.L. Lawrence Grocery, where my dad worked in the town square there, and read him the telegram. And he went to get Billy and Jean. They were both working. One of them was working at a drugstore there, and the other one might have been working at the little theater. And so Jean, on the way home, said, "Let's not tell Mama about Don." And Daddy said, "No, hon, we have to tell her." And I remember that's the only time I saw Mother cry, I believe, or the first time I saw her cry, because she just was broken up. And the sad irony, too, is that Billy's birthday, our sister Billy's birthday, was August 4th, and he'd sent her money for some kind of gift. And my birthday was August 30th, and he sent a check for $25 with the message for them to buy me a bicycle. And we got that, we got the message of his death, and then a few days after that we got the letter with the $25 check for my bicycle. And of all the older brothers and sisters, I was around Deb and Don, the two oldest, very little until later in life. One time we didn't see Deb for 7 years. And Don was, he came to visit us when I was around 6, but I generally have a pretty good memory for things that happened at home and in general, but I don't remember his visit. I remember he had a beautiful girlfriend named Betty Matthews with a lot of interesting, she was a very beautiful, interesting young woman who was mostly Indian from Oklahoma, Native American. And she stayed with us for a week once. And then later they broke up. I'm not quite sure why. I think he seemed very intelligent and progressive in many ways, but I think he didn't want her to join the Women's Army Corps, the WACs, and she did. But they did break up while he was in flight school. He was training to be a pilot, and he broke up with her, and he was very sick at the time he was taking his solos. He had a very, very bad cold or flu, and Jiggs was 2 or 3 years younger and not nearly as intelligent a student, but Jiggs passed flight school with flying colors, and Don was washed out, as the term they used, and he became a radio operator and tail gunner and was a sergeant in the Air Force, in the Army Air Corps, flying on a B-17. And we learned later that he and 2 other crewmen had died heroically trying to save the life of the turret gunner who was trapped. And it's not clear whether they chose to go down with him and end their own lives, or whether they were trying at the very end to get him free so they could bail out. The rest of the crew bailed out and survived, but the plane crashed, and they still had their bomb load. They crashed in an area in Saint-Lô, France, and killed a lot of Canadian troops because all the bombs exploded when the plane crashed. I remember later we got his ring, and it was charred from the fire.
What year was that?
1944. August 8th, 1944.
And 2. Don was shot down in 1944, and the proceeds from his death allowed the family to pick up and move to Lubbock, about 120 miles east. They moved to 2802 Ruby Street, later Amherst Street, a few blocks north of Texas Tech, a neighborhood of middle-class people called Arnett Benson, which became a Hispanic barrio in the late 60s. Take us through that time.
Well, first of all, Lubbock is west of Espermont, not east.
Okay.
West and a little bit north.
Okay.
Don had, there were some benefits from the military on his death, but also he had a private insurance policy. And I remember my parents making a decision at one point as to whether or not to take a lump sum payment or an annuity. And they chose to take an annuity, so they got a small amount of money for many years after his death. And I believe it was from his private insurance policy, they had enough money to buy the house in Lubbock. In October 1944, we moved. My mother had, it's interesting, I didn't know about all the details until many years later, but my dad had just sent her to Lubbock on the Greyhound bus, or Trailways bus, to find a house and buy it. And she did it herself and met a man named Leon Farr. I had 2 pretty girls about my age that I got to know later. And it was a corner lot. Okay, after Mother bought the house, she came back and we moved very quickly. And we had a neighbor named Henry Williams, a tall, thin man who wore khaki. I remember wore these new, look new, khaki shirts and trousers. I think they were Dickies. And he worked at a service station there some, and he had a truck that he made a living hauling with from his truck. It was a good-sized truck with large sideboards, big enough to hold our cow and at least a dozen chickens, all the furniture, in our 3-bedroom home in Aspermont. We lived in an old house that rented for $5, and I think it went up to $7 a month in the last years we were there. And Daddy paid Henry Williams $17 to drive us, all the family members, and the cow and chickens and furniture and our dog Champ. And so there was room in the cab for Mother Inez, my third sister, and me, and Daddy and Slick rode on top of the furniture in the back of the truck. But when we got to Spur, Texas, the winds were so high it was dangerous for them to be there to ride on top of the furniture, so they took the bus from Spur, Texas to Lubbock. And I remember we moved, it was in October and not too far ahead of Halloween. I remember celebrating Halloween in Lubbock, and shortly after we got there I saw the great movie, sad movie about Black Beauty, the horse that had so many hardships and travails. And I was in the 3rd grade, and we had to, they were building a school near us in Arnett and Benson, but it wasn't finished, so I had to take a bus to K. Carter School on 6th Street and Avenue Q. Then I remember my teacher's name was Ms. Bonner, and she said, Miss Scott, I think that little boy is too small to be in the 3rd grade. Maybe we should put him back a year. And then she said, no, he's a good reader, so we'll leave him in the 3rd grade.
But you were in elementary school across the street at McWhorter.
Yeah,
Correct.
after it was a block away at that time. It finished the end of my 3rd year, so I went there for two years and part of a year.
At what point did you take up boxing? Didn't Jiggs buy you some boxing gloves?
Yeah, our 3rd brother Jiggs bought a nice 2 pair of boxing gloves, beautiful boxing gloves. I remember the purple leather and 1 pair, and the beautiful tan leather in the other pair when I was 9. Then I learned to box. I used to box a kid about my size. He was a grade behind me, named Bobby Brawley. And my friend Cotton Wilkerson, who was a very good boxer, used to box his brother S.E. Brawley, who was redheaded and slick, nicknamed him Red Dome. So Cotton used to box Red Dome, and I would box Bobby Brawley. And came in handy because when I was in the 5th grade, this kid was taller than I was and kind of skinny, but really mean-spirited bully named Joe Putman. And I remember one day he would push people around, and he picked on me some, and finally one day I just decided that he was bigger than I was, so I probably couldn't whip him, but I was not gonna take his bullying anymore. So I punched him when he started. I think he pushed me, and I punched him, and I just beat the hell out of him, and he never bothered me again after that. So boxing helped, because I was small for my age, so when people knew that I could box, and then later when I boxed in Golden Gloves, after boxing in the Golden Gloves, I never had any more street fights, partly because people left me alone, and partly because I realized that fighting is very hard work, and you don't do it unless there's really a reason to fight.
You've always worn spectacles from an early age. How did you manage to see your opponent?
Well, that was a disadvantage. In fact, when I first started to school in Aspermont, the 1st grade teacher said to my mother, and I thought it was strange that my cousin Betty learned to read at 5, and I thought that I was as smart as she was, but I couldn't read. And so when in the 1st grade, the teacher said, Miss Scott, that little boy can't see well enough to read. So my mother took me 127 miles on a Greyhound bus to an ophthalmologist in Lubbock named J.T. Hutchinson. They named a junior high school after him. And he said to my mother that I should have been wearing glasses when I was 2 and a half. And she said, well, I didn't think children could answer questions intelligently at that age. And he said, well, we could tell from the test what they need. And I had those little gold rim round glasses. In fact, I was wearing those when the pilot saw me. And by the way, I was dressed in my striped coveralls and had wearing those round gold rim glasses. A little white-haired kid who looked about 4 or 5 when I was 6. And I also had Don, my brother Don, had given me some really beautiful wings that were about 2 inches wide from his flight training. And I used to pin those on my overalls rather.
Didn't you have about 30 fights as a Golden Glove?
Oh, not sure. It was 3 years, probably not quite 30 fights.
Call from unavailable.
Yeah.
Shoot.
Okay, you asked about how my limited eyesight or very bad eyesight affected my boxing. It was a major disadvantage. In fact, early I started boxing Golden Gloves when I was junior in high school at the age of 16. And boxed 3 years. First of all, I realized that I would never be a very good boxer because of my eyesight. So that was kind of a simple justification for not trying to be more scientific or more defensive as a boxer. I just got in there and slugged it out. I learned how to hit hard. I strengthen my hands and forearms I would roll up paper and put white adhesive tape around it, make 2 of them, and squeeze them as hard as I could 100 times or more every day. And that develops some power in the forearm. And I learned, like Rocky Marciano, to shift my weight when I punched, and I could hit harder than anybody I ever boxed. I could knock people down even though I was fought in a flyweight division, 112, 113 pound class. But I got in there and slugged it out and was not a very good defensive boxer. I won about half the fights and lost half, of course. And the most disastrous one was when I was 17, I guess, and I was fighting in the open division. So if you fight there are 3 classes: novice, high school, and open division. If you fight in the open division, you have to fight anybody in your weight class. And as I said, I was 17, and we went to Papa, Texas, and fought in a tournament there. And I was paired off against a guy who was 28 years old and had over 100 fights, and he was a champion in the Navy. His name was Elmo Sams. And I could hit harder than he could. In fact, in the first round, I landed a pretty good punch and jarred him some, but he was a much smarter boxer than I was. And in the second round, I was still on my feet, but he was punishing me pretty badly. So one of the virtues of amateur boxing is if you don't have a chance, they'll stop it. So they stopped it in the second round with a technical knockout, TKO.
You wore headgear, of course, at that time. No?
No, we didn't. That came in later. But the referees were very conscientious, and if you had no chance of winning, they would stop the fight. And that's what happened when I fought that guy. And it was interesting because, I knew he was experienced, and I think somebody told me before I got in the ring that he was a champion, a Navy champion when he was, as I said, 28 years old and I was 17.
It's funny because I don't think of you. You're not a tough guy. You're not a violent guy at all. Just the opposite. But when you got to high school, a lot of your friends were pretty tough. Say Don Good was one of them.
Yeah, Good.
Chuck.
the toughest one was Chuck Edward. Good was pretty tough too, and Good was fearless. In fact, one time, Don Good was his name. He grew up in Rawls and came to Lubbock when he was a junior in high school, and we became close friends, and we were even in the Army together at the same time. And he was one of the toughest guys in town was a fellow named Jack Godfrey, and he had I don't know if he was married to her at that time. Later he married her. He had a very pretty girlfriend named Bobby Lean Spence. Good was a very good dancer. He loved to dance, and when he was drinking, he liked it even better. And one night we were all at a dance, and he was dancing with Bobby Lean, and she liked him, and she was kind of flattered that he was interested in dancing with her and that he was such a good dancer. And he wasn't very big. He was about 5'9", and he weighed about 180 pounds or so. And so while he was dancing with her, he would nibble on her ear a little bit. And Jack Godfrey was probably not only the toughest guy in town, at least that I knew of at that time, but he was, as Chuck pointed out one time, he said Jack would, when he fought people, he would hurt them badly if he needed to. And he came over to me because he knew I was a friend of Good's, and he said, you better tell your friend to cool it with Bobby Lean. And so after the dance ended, I went over to Good and I said, you better back off a little bit because Jack is noticing you're nibbling on her ear, and he doesn't like that, and if you don't back off, you're probably going to get tangled with him, and you don't want to do that. He said, I'm not afraid of Jack. And he backed off a little bit, but he was still more affectionate than he should have been. In fact, one time Good, just before I went in the Army, he loved those clubs in Lubbock, but he would cause problems, and so we went to 2 or 3, and they would see him and they'd say, well, you can go in, but he can't. And Good, I remember when I graduated from Tech, and the next day I jacked to Louisville, Kentucky, and went to France that summer to work in the student exchange work program, and people had some parties for me before I left, some of my close friends, and I felt bad that Good didn't tell me goodbye or anything, and later I found out that he was in jail for DWI because they finally took his license away for 2 or 3 drunk driving after those citations.
That's one of my favorite stories, the wreck he had that messed up his eye.
Yeah, that was terrible.
Tell us what happened there.
Well, he was, again, he loved to drink and dance, and he was out until about 2 in the morning drinking and dancing and doing more drinking probably than usual. And he'd taken his lady friend home and was going through town, and there was a construction site, and they, when the construction site interferes with the sidewalk, what they do is put up wooden barriers in the street, and for people to walk safely along near the sidewalk, but on the edge of the street. And so between his partly sleep, partly drunkenness combination, that he was going south on the street, and I think it was a one-way street, and he veered somewhat to the left and hit one of those barricades, and it was a freak accident because normally the car would have just knocked it down, but because of the angle, one of the 2x4s came through the window and hit him right on the left side of the face. It just tore much of his face off. And so that was about 2 o'clock in the morning, and about 4 or so I got a call from my friend Doyle Ewing, who we called Shrimp, and he said, Good's in emergency, let's go over there. So we went over there, and first a dental surgeon had worked on him. He was unconscious. And when the dental surgeon finished, they took him up to the room, and this doctor, kind of chubby, bald doctor was there, and he was in the bed, and there were 4 of his friends there, and the doctor started working on him, and he said, "Oh, he's choking up, we're going to have to do a tracheotomy." And he said, we don't have time for anesthesia, so you'll have to hold him. So the 4 of us, one took a leg, one took an arm on both sides, and he did the tracheotomy, and Good was choking up, and the doctor kept joking to try to relax us, and at one point he said, "I'm afraid we're about to lose him." And he just backed away. Good stopped breathing, and the doctor backed away. Fortunately, the dental surgeon came by to check on him, and he went over and pounded on his chest, and then he gave him CPR and brought him back. But he was out he stopped breathing for at least a minute, maybe almost 2 minutes. And then he was in a coma for 6 to 8 weeks. And when he came out of the coma, he was like a retarded child. And we would visit him. In fact, Grover went with me to visit him in the hospital. In fact, his aunt one time was there. Her name was Dovey, very sweet lady, and Good knew a lot of cowboys. And I remember this one older guy there with with starched and pressed Levi's, put his hat down. And Good's Aunt Dovey came in, and she, and I said, "Well, Dovey, you're sitting on that man's hat." She wasn't, of course, but I tricked her into thinking that. And Good was in the hospital there for maybe a month, making very little progress, and they decided to send him to the VA hospital in Corpus Christi. And one of the black men that I'd known from the black baseball team, the Lubbock Black Hubbers, owned an ambulance service, and they got him. He made a good price to drive him in the ambulance all the way to Corpus Christi. So I rode in the ambulance with him, and Good was, I remember he was in his hospital gown. He had this funny little straw hat on, and he got out and when they were filling up the car at a service station, and we had trouble getting him back in the car. He wouldn't cooperate, and then he could speak, but his mind was not working well at all. And I thought that, first of all, we didn't think he was going to live through the night, and then the doctor revived him. But then after 6 or 8 weeks at that VA hospital, he came back to Lubbock. And he was terribly scarred. His left eye was lower than the right eye, and he refused to have plastic surgery. But his mind was, Good was very intelligent. He was very good in math, and he and other friends knew baseball and all kinds of athletic statistics that I was never interested in learning. And his mind came back. And he lived about 20 years after that, but he was never, he didn't get in any more fights after that, because if he'd been hit in the head, it could have killed him.
Tell us about Chuck, and then also at that time you also went into the Marine Corps Reserve.
Yeah, well, I met Chuck when I was a sophomore in high school. I was taking auto mechanics, and Chuck was in the metal shop part. The auto mechanics and metal shop people shared a large room that had acetylene and arc welding in the metal shop part, and a pretty extensive auto mechanics program. And that's the program I was in. And Chuck was in metal shop, and I got to meet him, and then later we became friends, but we didn't become close friends until the next year when both of us started boxing Golden Gloves. And Chuck was, I tell people, not being modest, but that Chuck was probably one of the very best Golden Glove boxers in the whole Southwest, and I was among the worst, because I could hit hard and I was pretty tough, but I was not, because of my eyesight, I never would have been a very good boxer. I was a flyweight, 112, 113 pound class, and Chuck was a lightweight. And one of the most amazing things about him was how smart he was as a boxer and how strong he was. He was 6 feet tall and weighed in at 137 pounds, and he'd started laying bricks with his dad when he was about 15 or so. And he was so strong that he could take, weighing 137 pounds, he could take a 100-pound weight and lift it over his head with either hand. And he told me once that his favorite punch was not a right to the chin, but punch to the heart. He would punish people. And he said, you know, he would hit them really hard in the heart. And he said that would just kind of take some of their energy. And he was, later he became, you know, later he got bigger, and as a bricklayer, he was a firm, you know, he was a strong union supporter, recognizing that unions not only improve people's wages, hours and working conditions, but made it much safer to work in construction, especially as a bricklayer and in other areas of construction. And he was one of the closest friends I ever had. He was like a brother, and never finished high school. He had to get married at the beginning of his senior year, but he was an avid reader all of his life and very intelligent.
So when did you go into the ROTC and the Marine Corps Reserve?
Well, at the age of 17, I went to a church camp in the San Bernardino Mountains and had a deep religious experience. It was a fundamentalist church encampment called Forest Home Christian Life Conference, and there was an archway through the entrance to the camp. It said Forest Home Christian Life Conference, elevation 5,280 feet, 1 mile near heaven. And Billy Graham had been associated with that group, and they also had a lot of famous athletes who were in college Christian groups. In fact, I'd never heard of this guy Don Mumal, but when I got back to Lubbock and told them that I'd met Don Mumal, they said I think he was one of the great All-Americans from maybe UCLA. And they also had one of the translators of the New Testament, J.B. Phillips, a British theologian and translator. I met him there, and it was a profound experience for me, and I realized that I was approaching adulthood. I just turned 17 about that time, and decided that I'd better change my life or I'd end up in prison or have a bad life. And because I was, you know, some of my friends were very talented young criminals, and we were in criminal activity. We had guns at one point. We never shot anybody or hurt anybody. But
you were somewhat of a rebel in kind of a rebel in high school. You didn't like high school.
No, I didn't like high school, and I didn't like any part of school until I got to college. But in Lubbock High, I started off on a bad foot because the second week of school, we were cutting class, and we drove on 18th Street. That was the street behind Lubbock High School, and the principal, Mr. Honey, saw us, and he started waving for us to stop, and we pretended he was waving at us, so we waved at him. And then he chased us in his car, but he couldn't catch us, but he saw us enough to remember us, and we were all kicked out the next day. And that was the second week of high school. So to start off high school on that way, you know, and my friends, in fact, I tried to change after going through the deep experience in the summer of between my junior and senior year. And two things I did. I talked to my parents and convinced them to sign up for me to go to the Army at 17. And I was going to serve, that was 1953, near the end of the Korean.
Now you hadn't graduated high school yet, or you had? Okay.
Beginning my senior year. And so, when my dad went to the Army recruiter with me, they said, we told them that we were there for me to sign up, and my dad was going to sign since I was 17. The recruiter, kind of chubby little guy with these Army clear plastic framed glasses, said, well, the Army's had a change in policy recently and will still take people under 18 whose parents signed, but now we strongly recommend that they go ahead and finish high school and then come back and join. So after he said that, my dad wouldn't sign. And so we went home, and I immediately joined the Marine Reserve and went to two summer camps that following summer, and then a second one the first one was at Camp Pendleton, the second one was at the Naval Station in San Diego. And I had to shoot with my left eye. I'd shoot left-handed because my right eye has never been correct. I can't read with it ever, and the left eye was pretty good. So by shooting left-handed, I'd learned how to shoot as a child. I'm ashamed to say, hunting and other things. I liked target practice. I shouldn't have killed animals. And I was, I think the second summer camp, I tied with Captain Allen, the company commander, for the highest score on the rifle range. We were experts and about 10 points above the closest competitor.
So then you entered college at Texas Tech.
Yeah, but at Lubbock High School,
Yeah.
I was there 2.5 years, and I made 1A. That was in band, and I was in. That was a vocational arts major. They would track students in those years, and I think nobody felt that I was too dumb to go to college, but I think they thought I was intelligent enough but incorrigible, so that's how I ended up in the vocational arts track. I figured it out once. I spent about 40% of my high school classes were in auto mechanics and woodwork, and I was terrible at both. And
But you had a change of heart, and then really
yeah,
went
but I did try to change, but when you have bad patterns and friends who are happy to go along with you to do things that you shouldn't be doing, it's you fall back into that whole the pattern of antisocial behavior. And see, I never liked the high school auto mechanics teacher. His name was James Burnett, and he was, of course, I didn't like school. In a few classes I was still a good student in. And junior high school I was already getting in trouble, but I was the best student in the 8th grade general math class that I took. But then in junior high, I took algebra in the 9th grade, and the algebra teacher was my homeroom teacher, Ms. Baisden. And I really clashed with her because the year before, when I was 13 in the 8th grade, we were at a high school junior high school assembly, and we were in the hall, and there was a cute girl in front of me with a long pigtail. And I couldn't resist grabbing that pigtail and giving it an affectionate yank, which didn't bother the girl, but Miss Basin was standing there watching me, and she went up and cracked me with her knuckles on top of the head, and that was very painful because a couple of days before I'd been running in the at the swimming pool in McKenzie Park, the big park in Lubbock. Along the side of the swimming pool, it was wet, and I slipped and banged the back of my head, and there was a knot about the size of an egg on the back. I didn't get knocked out, and I didn't get any medical attention, but it was very painful. And when she cracked me on top of the head with her knuckles, it really, pain just shot through me, and I said, "You have the right to discipline me, but don't you ever hit me again. Don't you ever lay your hand on me. If you do, I'll hit you back. I guarantee you." Well, then I had her in algebra, and I liked algebra, and I was good in it, but I didn't cooperate with her. In fact, I was kind of political illiterate, more like most people my age at that time. And the worst thing I could think of to call her was a communist. So I called her a communist one day, and remember she failed me the second semester of ninth grade algebra. So I had to take Algebra 1 again in high school because she failed me. In fact, she gave me an F and a F, O, and then U for in red in my report card, unsatisfactory deportment. And
Well, how is it if you hated school so much you went on to pursue an academic career? Was there something that changed in you that once you got to tech?
Well, it made a big difference. Two friends, Robert Collins and Harold Woolley Bear. They were both very intelligent young people, very intelligent boys, and we were close friends. And they started playing musical instruments when they were in about the 7th grade, and both of them were very talented musically. And so 2 years later, I tried to follow their pattern, following their footsteps, but I didn't have I was way behind. I didn't have their musical aptitude, and so I stuck with that for a year. But I was in Lubbock High. I was a good student in algebra, but I deliberately failed the senior English test. You had, at the end of your junior year, you had to take a test to determine whether you'd go into senior English or basic English. And my friends couldn't pass the test, most of them, so I deliberately failed it so I could be in class with them. And I remember doing a lot of stupid things. The two that I recall are in my homeroom class. The homeroom teacher, Mr. Orr, he taught physics, and he had these big tables, and so we would sit at the tables because there was a classroom for physics and a lot of experimental lab work. And so I remember we would carve lines into those tables and take and make them into an improvised shuffleboard. And then in that English class, the basic English class, I remember one time, one of our dumb stunts was to take a match and put it in our mouths and then strike it and throw it, and it wouldn't light, but it'd just leave a trail of smoke. And then I built a fire in a styrofoam cup in the class, and so those were the kind of dumb things I did. And in the auto mechanics class, I had clashed with the teacher, James Burnett, partly because he would go from totally permissive to authoritarian. Okay, at Lubbock High School, most of it was just for truancy, but I understand that I set a record for getting kicked out of school 6 times in 5 semesters. And the last time was the most disastrous. Again, I tried to shape up some, but as the Bible says, the spirit was willing, but the flesh was weak, and my friends were not the best influence on me either. So in the auto mechanics class one day in the locker room, this kid named Wainwright, I think his first name was Colin, and we called him Weasel, and a guy bigger kid named Archie who'd moved from Arkansas. They were about to fight, and I remember, I didn't think either one would be capable of hurting the other, so I pushed one into the other about the time the teacher came in, and Mr. Burnett, and so he didn't say anything to the two actually starting to fight. He said to me, "Let's go to the office." And so it was a big high school of 2,000 students, and we wore white coveralls over our street clothes, and a lot of times we would we would do stupid things like putting her hand in grease and then go slapping somebody on the back and leave a black handprint on the back of these white coveralls. And at one point, Mr. Burnett saw me do that to somebody. I didn't realize he was watching me, and he came up to me and he said, "You know what I'd do if somebody did that to me?" And I said, "No, what would you do?" And he said, "I'd slap the hell out of them." And I said, "Well, you know what I'd do if somebody slapped the hell out of me? I'd slap the hell out of them." And then he said, "Well, if you don't stop lying to people and you don't change your ways, you're going to end up having a bad life, maybe in prison." And I said, "Well, first of all, I'm not interested in your opinion. I don't place any value in your judgment, so I don't care what you say about me." And so that particular day, he did tell me at one point, he had ulcers, and he did tell me at one point that I was the major cause of his ulcers, which seems a bit of hyperbole, but he really seemed to believe that. So at any rate, that day he came in and said, "Oh, let's go to the office." And I said, "Well, I don't want to go to the office in my coveralls." So this was a locker room, and so my locker was 2 feet away, 3 feet away. So I just unzipped my coveralls to take them off, and he said, "I said right now," and I ignored him, and so he yelled at me, he said, "Now!" He grabbed me by the shoulders and slammed me up against the wall, and it hurt and it startled me, and I was boxing then, so just out of reflex, I punched him in the chest with my right and hit him in the chin with my left, hit him in the chin with my right, and knocked him up against the wall. And this thuggy guy named Joe Beard, who had a crippled leg because he was stealing a radio from a car in a used car lot, and the security people they called the bonded patrol, who drove around in jeeps, pulled a gun and shot him in the leg when he was running away. Afterward, he would have sued, but at any rate, he said, "Hit him again, Scott." So then Burnett left, and he came back in. He said, "You ready to go to the office?" He took me to the office, and of course he didn't tell them that I hit him because he had to say that he slammed me up against the wall. But he said, "I want him out of my class. He's been a problem ever since I've known him. He's more disruptive than any other student I've had." And so then he stormed out, and Mr. Howarth, the assistant principal, said, "Well, it was 8 days or so before the end of the fall semester." So he said, "Well, if you can't finish this class, you'll lose all the credits, and it'll take you another semester, another year to graduate. So I suggest that you ask him if he'll allow you to finish the semester." And so there's no way I would have said to him, "Will you let me finish?" And so I went back to class and I said, "Mr. Howarth suggested that it would be good if I could finish this semester, the 8 days that are left of class." And I said, "What do you think about that?" And he said, "Well, as I remember once you told me what you thought of my opinion." And I said, "Well, I remember saying that, but what do you think?" And he said, "Well, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'll allow you to stay the rest of the term, the 8 days of class, but after that, I never want to see or hear from you, and I don't even want to hear what's happening to you." So I finished the semester, and by the way, I had been in that same shop class. I was holding on to a fan belt one day, and this guy named James Swin hit the starter, and it cranked my hand through the fan belt and the pulley, and the fingernail came off whole, and part of the tip was just hanging down. The doctor had to snip it off, and they put it. Then this bone was broken here, and so I was taking typing because I thought it'd be useful when I went to college. And so I went to this typing teacher, Mr. Dollar, and I said, "Well, Mr. Dollar, I can't take the final exam, so what about my grade?" And I was making a C, I think, not my greatest course. And so he said, "Well, I'll talk to Mr. Honey about it." And he went to Mr. Honey, the guy who'd expelled us the second week at school. My friend Bear one time, his nickname was Buster. And one day we're in the hall, he was going downstairs, we were coming up, and Bear, my friend Harold Woolley Bear, said, "How you doing there, Buster?" And he called and he said, "What did you call me?" Just a few minutes ago. And Bear said, "What do you mean, sir?" He said, "What did you call me? Did you call me Buster?" He said, "No, I said Mister," and you probably might misunderstood Mister for Buster. Well, and so his advice to Mr. Dollar was to, if he can't take the test, he can't pass, so just give him an F. So I had an F in typing, and there's no way I could continue that, so I talked my parents into letting me go to Roosevelt to live with my sister Jean and brother-in-law Wendell. And I never told them the whole story. I just told them that it would take at least an extra semester or an extra year to graduate. So when I went to Roosevelt, I had to be on better behavior because they let me go to school there without paying tuition as somebody from out of that district. And one time they were organizing a trip to the South Plains Fair. They were just going to boycott school, and the principal came to me and he said, "Are you going to go with the other students?" I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "No, if you go, we'll have to reconsider your status as an outsider in the district." So I went, and well, maybe 2 or 3 people in one of my classes. But there I took I was a good student at Roosevelt because I was one of the principal, Mr. Woods, he taught only one class, second year algebra, and his algebra was higher than the college algebra class that I took at Tech.
It's actually grades 1 through 12 at the time, correct?
Yeah.
All in one school?
Yeah, all in one school in Roosevelt. That's right, and I went from a class of 400 at Lubbock High to 15 at Roosevelt. So, and then I started to school in the summer. As soon as I graduated, I was planning to work in the oil fields around Andrews to make a little money for school. But then Robert Collins and Harold Woolley Bear, my 2 friends who were brilliant, and Bear was the most talented young criminal I ever met. He had the gall to do anything. They said, "Let's start to Tech. There'll be a lot of pretty girls. It'll be kind of like a country club atmosphere." So we started a week late, and I didn't bother to take any of the placement exams because you didn't have to in the summer. So they put me in an English university level English class, and in 2.5 years of high school, I never made, I didn't read the assignments. And one English class in high school, I went 3 times the entire semester, and so I didn't know what the teacher was talking about. But I started writing essays in her class, and on the first essay I did, she gave me a B+. She said, and I crossed out a lot of things. She said, "Your paper's very messy, but you write very well."
An undiscovered talent.
Well, I started late. 1 week late in a 6-week course, and I was totally unprepared for the class to begin with, but I caught up, and then ended up making a B in that class, and Bear and Robert dropped out. And by the way, but he went on to be a very successful cinematographer and won an Emmy for the Peggy Fleming special and for a National Geographic series on great apes when they're separated from their kind. And he made a lot of money in Hollywood, but had 5 different wives, and he ended up not living very long. I think he died at 72.
Woolley?
No, Robert Collins.
Oh, Robert Collins.
His mother had dated Roy Rogers. In fact,
Robert Collins.
he had pictures in his house on Trigger. Because when his mother dated Roy Rogers before he changed his name. She was a film handler at Republic Studios in Hollywood. So then, but I remember being nervous about taking a Spanish class, because in junior high, took a Spanish class in the 7th grade, and there were 2 of my friends, one named Johnny Lozano and Eugene Pais, were the 2 friends, and they spoke Spanish fluently. They didn't know any Spanish grammar, or probably couldn't read Spanish, but I palled around with them, and when she gave us the final test at the end of the fall semester, I didn't know any of the grammar questions, so I just put my name on a blank sheet of paper and turned it in. And afterwards she said, well, there's no way you can go start the spring semester. So I was nervous about taking a Spanish class at Texas Tech, but I had a very distinguished professor. He was head of the department, Dr. John Dowling, and he spoke about 6 languages and was very good teacher. And he, first test I took in his class, I made a 98 on it. And so, again, I realized that if I tried languages, I could learn languages pretty well. But I started off as pre-law at Texas Tech, and then partly because of that religious experience, I changed to pre-ministerial. And then I took, after taking classical Greek and New Testament Greek and studying other languages, I was skeptical of translations, and something about the Southern Baptists believing in a literal burning hell, and that seemed hard for me to understand, how people could be so evil that they would deserve to live in eternity from the pain of physical and mental anguish of a hell, that total punishment. And it bothered me also that in the second semester of New Testament Greek, the word for hell in the New Testament was Gehenna, and that was a Greek word for the area outside the city where they burned the trash. And I realized, people say that poetry is what's lost in translation. Well, I could see many other instances of errors in translation, and I couldn't believe that the Bible was the inspired word of an omnipotent, omniscient being that punished people forever. And I was also bothered by the differences between several books in the New Testament, because in some of them Jesus was a very benevolent, gentle person. In other parts he was not, and so I thought it was strange that Jesus could be such a different figure depending on which person had written about him in the New Testament.
So you opened up some horizons.
Majoring in foreign languages, and the first experience studying outside the country was a 6-week summer term in Mexico City between my junior and senior years, and that was very good, and my Spanish improved a lot.
Wow.
And then, see, I liked tech and realized that if I worked hard, and I went to half the first summer, then I went to all of the second summer, and so I graduated in 3 years. I had a BA by the time I was 20, and
we're fixing that.
Yeah, and I got the opportunity to the greatest experience of that era was the day after I graduated from Texas Tech. A friend took me out on the highway. I hitchhiked to Louisville, Kentucky, and joined a group there in a student exchange work program, and spent the summer in Paris. Great to be 20 years old in Paris.
Now we've come on to question 3. And we're really getting into some more adventurous times of your life. I know you were in the Peace Corps in Colombia, and in the U.S. Army stationed in Germany as a dental assistant. Can you tell us about the first time that you left the country? I know that you hitchhiked the day you graduated from Tech, and hitchhiked to Louisville, and etc. So let's pick it up from there.
Okay, well that was The second time, or the third time I left the country for a prolonged period. The first time was in Mexico City when I studied there in a summer term, 1956, when I was 18 years old. The other time that I traveled in Mexico and Guatemala, but that was later. But the most interesting and adventurous travel of my early life was being selected to participate in a student exchange work program in Paris. It was organized by a French group and a professor at the University of Louisville, and 51 of us were selected, and we all but 3 worked in Paris. And I was very lucky. The people who chose me manufactured machine accessories, and they thought since I was a graduate of Texas Tech that I was some kind of techie or engineer. I worked for Maison Corbier. He was a 65-year-old Belgian who had a small and successful business. And so when I went in the first day, my French was pretty good. I had only 2 years of university French, but I'd already studied 3 or 4 years of Spanish and a year of German and 2 semesters of Greek, and I was pretty good, and 4 semesters of French.
Spanish will help your French quite a bit.
Oh yeah, it would.
Vice versa.
Romance language. And so where I worked, nobody spoke English, and so as I said, I'd had only 2 years of university French, but I was pretty good in grammar. And when they would give us tests from the Alliance Française, I wouldn't necessarily score the highest in reading skill and vocabulary, but I would always be the highest in the grammar part. And if you learn grammar well, and you're thrust into a situation where you have to use the language, you pick it up pretty quickly. So, in fact, I really liked the office atmosphere. The head of the department was Rodger. His name was Rodger Pecariot, and he'd worked with the U.S. Army to liberate France during the Second World War, and had a very high opinion of Americans. And the person who was just under him would come in, and they would spend 15 minutes every morning talking about personal things. The assistant manager he had a beautiful German Shepherd, and he would talk about his dog about half of that 15-minute period. And I thought that was very different from American business practices. I couldn't think of any American situation where the manager and the assistant manager would talk about things totally unrelated to the business for sometimes more than 15 minutes. And they were very, very kind to me, and they were amazed that I spoke French. And by the end of the summer, I was more fluent in French than Spanish, because I had 3 hours. They told me that I was the only one of the 50-something students who was told that they really didn't need me to do that much, but they liked the program and wanted to support it. So they said, you can either come in in the morning or come in the afternoon. You don't need to be here 6 or 8 hours a day.
What type of business is it again?
It was, they manufactured machine accessories like drill bits and that sort of thing. In fact, one time they'd gotten an order from Germany, and since they knew that I'd studied a year of German at Texas Tech, they thought I might be able to figure out what the German company was trying to order. And it turned out that they were ordering wooden dowels. Not a very big order that they didn't make much money on, but they were pleased that I could figure out what the German company wanted to order, and they could ship it off. And I remember asking the young woman if she understood my French, and it's interesting because I saw a big cultural difference. In Latin America, if I asked somebody if they understood my Spanish, they would say, because not many gringos that they encountered spoke that much Spanish, they would say, oh, your Spanish is wonderful. But she said, well, you have a prominent American accent, but I can understand everything you say, and you seem to understand everything I say. And so by the end of the summer, I was fluent in French. And it was a great time, and one of the most interesting weekends was I went back to have, oh, by the way, I stayed in the Belgian pavilion, which was bigger than the American pavilion at the Cité Universitaire in Paris. And it was a bigger building, and it was interesting because men and women were on the same floor, and they had communal backgrounds. You know, there's privacy. The urinals were set apart from the stalls, but then the showers were communal also. Of course, they would be partitioned, so women had their privacy, but I felt that was very strange. And then the dining room was very interesting. And again, that pavilion was larger than the U.S. pavilion, even though Belgium's such a small country. But I remember the stout old French woman who brought in they would serve coffee in bowls about this size, and they would put in about a third of the strongest coffee I'd ever seen. It was like mud, really delicious. And then she would pour in 2/3 of a bowl of steaming milk, and then you put in your own sugar or honey. And then she would serve baguettes that were so fresh, they were still warm. They'd been baked that morning. And then the French butter, I'd had butter as a kid, but I never really liked it. But the French butter had just a great taste. Bread has never tasted so good as that fresh, warm baguette with French butter, and then a big bowl of steaming milk and coffee. And I was there until I finished the program. And then later, after I traveled to Spain and met Mike Borders and one of the other guys in the program, and Tom Milner, who became a friend for life. In Spain, I ran out of money and I had to hitchhike from the Spanish-French border on the Mediterranean at Port Louis, I think the name was, and such a great place. And I remember I calculated that I walked about 23 miles that first day because I found walking such a pleasant experience, and I didn't like the idea of hitchhiking that much, but I met all kinds of interesting people.
That's when you slept on that bench.
Yeah, that's right.
Correct.
That's right. And and one Italian guy I traveled with for 2 or 3 days. It took me 4 days to hitchhike.
Were you hitchhiking?
From there back to Paris, and two parts were that first night I was sleeping on a bench, and I remember these cars, dreaming cars were passing by, and I would wake up, and then as I was asleep there, I heard somebody walking by, and that kind of startled me because I was, in a strange country and strange place, and an old Frenchman was walking by, and he didn't know I was sleeping there on the bench, and he got right in front of the bench. I jumped up, and that scared and startled him, and I had to apologize, and that was kind of difficult to make him understand that I wasn't being threatening or hostile. And then the woman that I'd met, maybe the third week or so I was in Paris, her name was Joan Finley. I was in the American dining room at it was kind of like an American lounge. The dining room was communal. In fact, I was kind of disappointed that when somebody dropped a glass or dropped a piece of silverware on the floor, all the students started banging on their trays or the table. And I'd heard so much about Europeans being so much better at language study and being more civilized in terms of foreign policy and other things. I thought that was kind of childish that they would do that. But I met this woman, and she had started talking to one of the guys in our group. And so he came over and he said, she's looking for somebody to hitchhike with her through the Loire Valley, see all the old great castles, the Chateau de la Vallée, Loire Valley. And so he took me over and introduced me to her. And she's at first I thought she was like most of the young Americans I'd met who were there in the summer spending their parents' money, living kind of lavishly in a beautiful city like Paris, but it turned out that she was in a Fulbright program getting her PhD in French literature and Romance languages, and was a really brilliant student.
From what school?
French. She was from the University of Illinois. And in fact, I think later, I tried to find her many years later and couldn't locate her, but her name was Joan Finley. And so we hitchhiked all over, and she was surprised that I spoke French as well as I did by that time, and we got along very well, and we stayed in youth hostels, and we didn't have a romance, but we were very close. And when I was hitchhiking back after being in Spain, she was doing graduate work at the University of Poitiers. I had to go right through there on the way back to Paris, and so I looked her up, and I always remember that she was attractive, not a great beauty, but she was attractive and very intelligent, and I apologized to her. I had to tell her that I thought she was there, like many other American students, spending her parents' money and not getting much benefit from that part of her education, but then she was a brilliant Fulbright scholar. And she was never that affectionate, but I remember when she saw me, she didn't know I was coming through to visit her, and I went onto the campus, and I was about 50 yards away when she saw me and recognized me. And it was kind of funny because she started running. She wasn't the type, she was an intellectual and academic combined, and she ran and gave me a big hug, and I had a good visit with her, and then hitchhiked the rest of the way back to Paris. And I remember meeting this old guy driving the little Citroën, the Force CV, that they had the top that just rolled back, and they were very cheap cars but very reliable. Renault, they called it Cat 4 CV. He was driving one of those, and again, my French was good enough that I could talk to him about anything. And so I remember he was saying one particular thing. He said, the French government is for the Americans, for the Russians, for the British. They're for everybody but the French people. And I thought that kind of political pronouncement was the kind of thing that I've been used to hearing in Texas when people would badmouth the government. And so when I got back, I slept, and I didn't have a place to sleep, so most of the time I slept in a British taxi. A guy named John Bolt, and he taught me. He said Americans don't know how to say cheerio, and he would spend time teaching Americans to say cheerio. I slept in his taxi for about a week, and then I also Milner was back then and sleeping, and that was in the American Pavilion. And I slept in his room a couple of nights, but his roommate was this strange Hungarian guy. This was 57, and he didn't like somebody else sleeping there. I would sleep in a chair with my feet on the sink. And so, since he was not very receptive to that idea, I was happy to have the taxi to sleep in for a while. And then took the boat back, and in late August, and the boat went from Le Havre, France, to Montreal.
So you left Paris and at that time, left France.
And I almost
What was your goal when you left there?
Well,
to go back home,
wanted
or
to do, I almost joined the army when I was in Europe. In Paris, I went to the army. There was an army garrison there, and I went there, and they said, well, you can join the army here. But I decided to go back. But another part of the story that complicated my life later, that was 1957, the year that 41 Americans went from the World Youth Festival in Moscow to China. And I was pretty ignorant politically, but I thought it would be good if I could go with the French delegation to Moscow for the World Youth Festival. It was very cheap, an inexpensive way to see the Soviet Union, and that was my main purpose, not for any political reason. But so to get information about that, I went to the Russian embassy in Paris and asked about that the World Youth Festival. I wanted as much information as I could get. And they said, well, we don't really have anything to do with it because the French Communist Party is organizing the tour and they're renting a train because they took 3,000 people from Paris on a chartered train to Moscow for the World Youth Festival. But then it turned out that that was occurring before I was released from my work. We had to sign a contract to work through, I believe it was August 10th, and they were leaving late July, and so I wasn't able to go. So, but I would have gone to China because that would have been a good opportunity. But later, when I was in the Army, that all came out, and that contributed to my not getting a cryptography clearance to go into communicating via cryptography and repairing the machines. It was a 52-week school that I joined after I knew I was going to be drafted. I volunteered for 3 years, and the recruiter said, you're qualified to take cryptography. And so after basic training, and I was explaining that long personal history form that you have to fill out. You have to give the names and addresses of all your brothers and sisters and your parents, and you have to give all the addresses that you've ever had, and very long, tedious form. And one of the questions was, have you ever been affiliated in any way with the communist organization? And I was naive, expecting to answer the question as simply as I could without hiding anything, because I thought if I said no and it came out that I dealt with the communist, the Russian embassy in Paris and the French communist organization, that they'd think I was hiding something.
So you left France, and where are you now?
Okay,
you
after
went on
I
a
left,
boat, and
yeah, we took the Greek liner back from Le Havre, France to Montreal, and then a guy named Ted Howard and I hitchhiked from Montreal to Louisville, and I thought of going to law school there at the University of Louisville, and then decided not to. But instead of going, that was by then September of '57. So
when did you enlist in the Army?
In October that same year.
Okay.
Yeah, short.
Okay,
not long after that.
Yeah.
So I hitchhiked. I decided to hitchhike to see my friend Shrimp Doyle Ewing. He was at Fort Gordon, Georgia, in the Army. He didn't know I was coming, and I hitchhiked all the way there, and I went to. He was at Fort Gordon, Georgia, Augusta, Georgia. And I found his unit and went there, and I said, I'm looking for Doyle Ewing, and they said, well, they'll be back in a few minutes. And as they were dismissed, this kind of fat sergeant said, hey, Ewing, there's a guy here to see you. And he was really, he was really amazed that I showed up, because he had no idea.
How did you get on base? You mean at the gate there?
Oh yeah, you could go in as a visitor. I told him I was visiting a friend of mine who was stationed there, and we went to the EM and Enlisted Men's Club that night. And he said, "There's something." We had a good dinner there, and he said, "There's a record I want to play." And he went over to the jukebox and he said, "Who do you think this is?" And it was the Crickets. That'll be the day. And he said, that's got to be Buddy Holly. And I said, oh, yes, it is. And Shrimp and I remembered that we talked about, we went to a Buddy Holly concert once at Lawson's skating rink there on College Avenue in Lubbock. And a kind of con man named Paul Carmelo from New York became a promoter of Buddy Holly and the other people. And he introduced Buddy that night, and he said, I need your attention, folks. Tonight you're going to get a real treat. Buddy Holly's going to sing one of his recent songs, Modern Don Juan, that I predict will be on the National Hit Parade in a matter of weeks. And it wasn't a very good song, and it never was on that. But Shrimp and I we were amused, because that night we weren't very impressed by Buddy Holly's performance. Later, that was early on in his career, later.
You didn't know how famous he was going to be?
No,
by any means.
we didn't. But then I was in Germany when I got the word from Mike Borders, this friend of mine who was the cousin of the Borders brothers who started Borders Books, sent me a letter about Buddy Holly's death. And of course I heard it in the news too. He was 21. That was in the winter of 59. Yeah, 59, yeah. So the Army was, I spent 22 months in the Army, and my old antisocial ways from high school.
Where did you enlist again?
I enlisted in Lubbock.
Okay, so you were back home.
Took basic training, and yeah, I got back early August, and that was August of 57. September of 57, and next month, October 25th, I enlisted in the Army for 3 years with the plan to go into cryptography. And that didn't work because everybody, when I was filling out the long personal history form at the end of basic training, I said to the sergeant, I said, well, I'm not quite sure how to answer this question about have you ever been affiliated anywhere with this communist organization. He said, well, tell me about it. And it was kind of a long story. He said, too long a story, just put down there CIC interview. So after I got to Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, the Signal Corps post base, they called me in. They said, well, you have an interview with G2, the intelligence people, about something you put on the personal history form. So I went there, and we literally went into a basement, into a literal vault. And one of the guys was an Irish-looking, tall, kind of Irish-looking guy with a bulbous red nose, and the other one was a dark Latino guy named Rivera. And so I probably started off on the wrong foot by asking him if he was by chance related to Diego Rivera. And he didn't think that was very funny. And so they're pretty humorless people. But yeah, they asked me all these questions, including, do you believe in a supreme being? And I said, that's irrelevant whether I believe in a supreme being or not. And they asked about this. And I explained to them what had happened in Paris that summer. That had just been a few months before. And so they transcribed everything, and if I cleared my throat, that showed them the transcript. And then I went back, and it was 9 pages long, and I signed it that was accurate, an accurate transcript of what I'd said. And they said, well, we don't think you'll have any problem. But then later, everybody in cryptography had to take a lie detector test. And when I took that, I was trying to relax, and I did such a good job that I dozed off a couple times, and that kind of upset the guy asking the questions. And he would come on in a good old boy manner, and yet that put me off rather than relax me, because when somebody comes on in a comradely way that you don't know, and then you know that their job is to observe your reactions, not only with the equipment, but just your facial expressions, body language, etc. That put me off, and at one point he said, he complained that I dozed off, and another time he said, well, we've been here an hour and a half, this generally takes 45 minutes to an hour. Because he would say, the way the lie detector works is they ask you a series of questions and record your answers, and then they say, other than as previously described, have you ever done so and so? They ask if you're a communist, or if you've had sex with a man, and all kinds of odd questions. And at one point he said, I told him I'd been in Spain. That came out, and he said, how are the women in Spain? Well, we did meet some very friendly hookers and took them into a pension where American Air Force guys were stationed, and I met some very interesting guys from New Mexico and Richmond, California, and different places. And so I told him about that, and they wanted to know about your criminal past. And so I said, well, as a juvenile delinquent, I was a criminal, but I never got caught. We did a couple of burglaries, and then we we figured out a way to get money out of Coke machines at night. And I said, we had guns, but we never hurt anybody with them. And so I neglected some of that. And when he would say, other than as previously discussed, have you ever done so-and-so? And I would try to be conscientious because I would think about something that I thought was relevant. And that's when he finally said, well, this interview is far too long. And went from a good old boy to kind of an impatient bureaucrat. And the very next day, they said, you're not getting a cryptography clearance. They'd given me an interim secret clearance, but cryptography clearance is, they say, harder to get than top secret. So they said, you're not getting that, but you have a interim secret clearance, so we'll send you to countermeasure school if you want to go. And I said, what's that? And they said, jamming radar. And I said, no, I don't want to go. I thought maybe I might get out of the Army early because I'd signed up for that and they didn't give it to me. And so they said, okay, we'll give you a choice. You can become a personnel specialist, basically a clerk, or light vehicle driver, Jeep driver, or clerk. And I said, well, put me down as a clerk. So they sent me to Fort Huachuca, Arizona. And I was there for a while, and I took the test to go to Russian language school and applied for Russian language school. And I scored very high on the language aptitude test. So
I was going to ask why they didn't originally, of course it's not the Army way, but why they didn't, with your language skills and background, why they didn't put you in an appropriate program at that time.
Well, the Army never really assigns people. In fact, the only people that ever do that role at all, and they do it in a clumsy and opportunistic way, are recruiters. They give you some kinds of tests and they say, well, based on your test, we can put you in. Like most people thought that going into the counterintelligence corps or cryptography would be a great career, an Army career. In fact, when I was in the Army, if you scored high on tests, they considered your Army IQ the average of the verbal of your vocabulary test and the math test, which had some algebra and maybe a little geometry. And I scored high, and so they said that I could. They were happy to send me to cryptography school, but when I applied for the Russian language school at Monterey, I was working in the post sergeant major, the highest ranking sergeant on the post.
As a clerk?
Yeah, as a morning report clerk, where you have to tabulate the number of people in each unit for the whole post. And Sergeant Turner was the guy's name, and Master Sergeant with a lot of years experience and a lot of power, and he said, we don't want to retrain somebody. It'd take us a while to retrain somebody. And I said, well, any 12-year-old could learn everything you need to know to do that job in 3 days of training at the very most. And he said, well, that's not the way we see it. So if you apply for any other language school, we'll send you to Anahuac or some terrible place, give you a bad assignment. But then a friend of mine worked in classification and assignment. One day he came to me and he said, would you like to be put on a levy to go to Germany? And I said, sure. I'd been there about 6 months. That's when I got lost in the mountains.
Yeah, that's the next thing I was going to ask, getting lost in Fort Huachuca.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Well, I'd been there 3 weeks or so, and it was a beautiful area. That part of southern Arizona, we used to ride motorcycles in the Chiricahua National Park. And we lived in a big adobe barracks. They called it the $1 Million Barracks. It housed about 200 people or so. And the elevation was around 5,000 feet. And that was beautiful. But I was, the Army, as I said, my old antisocial ways from high school came out in the Army because I thought the Army represented a bad combination of dumb people in power and
bureaucracy,
and a kind of iron bureaucracy too. And so I went AWOL in basic training, got away with it, with a friend who was scheduled to go into the CIC. I don't know whatever happened because he's a very smart guy, and he was an English a music major at the University of Colorado at Boulder, and he was he had a lot of guts. He and I, when they finally gave us a weekend pass at the end of the training, the first person in the company to have his pass pulled was me, and the second person was Jones, my friend. His name was Emerson Jones. He was Welsh. His father was a Welsh immigrant, and so I've never known. I doubt that he survived in the counterintelligence corps because he was smart and independent thinking. And
so you got lost.
And so I was very frustrated there. It was kind of dull, and I knew that there was a Mexican border town 28 miles away. And I thought, and I remembered that I could walk 20 miles and maybe hitchhike some, and so I thought if I went through the mountain area, it would be a lot shorter. I didn't realize how rugged the mountains were because our post was at 5,000 feet, and I hiked at least 2,000 above that in the mountains, and I was hoping once I got high in the mountains I could see the lights of the Mexican border town, but it's still a long, long way away, and I didn't take into consideration how difficult it is to go, say, a mile as a crow flies in mountains. You have to wind around and up and down hills, and so I was there. I went on a Saturday morning, and by Saturday night, I found a lot of interesting. I found an old cabin that had 50-year-old canned goods and newspapers from 50 years before, and
were you carrying canteen and pack, or
no, I didn't.
no water?
No, and I just had my own civilian clothes. I had a T-shirt and shirt and khaki trousers and my combat boots, which were completely worn out by the end of that ordeal. But so Saturday night, I realized that there was no way I could get back. So I found a place to sleep in leaves, and the next morning I was very thirsty, and the elevation there was at least 6,000 feet, so it got cold, and I was taking a bit of cold. And then the next day I would be, I wasn't feverish, but I would be very hot and sweaty and choked up some, and so I learned that if I could find water that was in the spring, so the snow had been melting, and so there was natural springs seeping out of of parts nearby. So I would climb up to a certain point and scour the mountains around, and where the foliage was greenest, that would meant that there was water, a spring there, water seeping out, and I'd find this really good fresh water, and would just I would drink all I wanted and relax and take a nap on a rock in the sun. And I remember one time I slid down an embankment and hurt my leg a little bit, and the next time I found a nice water place and took a nap. When I got up, I had trouble walking, so that scared me a little bit, having a bad leg so far away from...
You didn't see any rattlesnakes?
No, but I could hear javelina hogs, wild boars, where I was sitting once and I heard one about 30 yards away, so I didn't want to encounter him, so I just sat there quietly until I couldn't hear him anymore. And then, so that was Sunday. Then I kept trying to find my way back.
That was the next day.
Yeah. Kept trying. That was after one night in the mountains, and I tried to find my way back and couldn't, and because I would be desperate to have water, and so I would get off my course to find water, and I knew that at a certain point there would be roads leading down from the mountain area to the main post, which was no more than a couple of miles away as the crow flies, if that far. So the second night I slept, and again it was colder than I was dressed for. And then the next day, I thought they'd realize I was AWOL and maybe start looking for me, and sure enough they did. They had 2 or 3 liaison airplanes, they call them L-19 airplanes, and 2 or 3 helicopters, and about 300 men in the search crew looking for me, because one of the guys I'd met in my company saw me leaving, going higher into the mountains, and he told them. And a couple of times I could see helicopters flying over, and I would wave at them and try to flash my tags, and at one point, a couple of times, I wasn't sure I was going to make it out, because especially the time when I took a nap, and then I got up and I had trouble walking, and I decided that if I wasn't going to survive, I was going to go out comfortably. I decided that if I was too uncomfortable and unable to move, that I would just figured out a solution would be to sharpen my dog tag on a stone and just cut the artery here or vein and bleed out. And I wanted to make sure I was comfortable, because the idea occurred to me that if your last moment in life, you shouldn't be in great pain or great discomfort, because that would kind of negate your whole life before that time. So I decided that if I couldn't survive, I was going to do it on my own terms with a certain amount of comfort. But then finally the helicopter flew over, and they never signaled to me. You know, it was very frustrating to see them up there, but not realize they'd seen me. They never waved back or indicated anything toward me, but they directed the search party. In fact, ironically, when they found me, I was on the last incline. If I'd gotten to the top of that mountain, there was a road there leading down to the main post. And so when they found me, they immediately tried to give me a roast beef sandwich, and I couldn't eat because my throat was swollen from I suffered probably some dehydration too. I did eat the orange, and they put me. You saw that picture.
That's a picture, black and white picture.
Yeah.
Why didn't they give you water immediately?
Well, they did give me a little bit of water, but I'd had water an hour or two before that anyway. So they thought since I hadn't eaten in 3 days that I'd be able to eat the roast beef sandwich. I couldn't eat it at all. And then they put me in the hospital for 4 days just for observation. And some people said it was more for mental than physical observation. There's nothing wrong with me, just a matter of exposure, a bit of a cold and exposure to colder climate than I was dressed for, but I was okay. And I was only 22 years old, and pretty healthy.
What about going AWOL? Did they make any charges on that? Or?
Oh, yeah. I was when I went AWOL in basic training and got away with it because I went with my friend, and he had his mother and grandmother pick us up in their old 10-year-old Ford sedan. So I got away with it. In fact, he was about my size, and so the Army in those years took away your civilian clothes when you're in boot camp. And so when we went to his home in Colorado Springs, right outside the post, I wore his clothes and he wore civilian clothes, and we went down to a section that troops go to, and we saw in fact we saw the squad leader in my unit, and a guy who thought that I was probably smarter than he was, but he didn't think I was a very disciplined soldier, and I thought he was a bit infatuated with authority. And we saw him, but he was no way he could have turned us in for that. And then one time when I was stationed at Fort Huachuca, we went to a particular border town, to the red light district, and you weren't supposed to spend the night there. And, you know, there's curfew, and so we didn't go back to the post until the next morning, and the MP stopped us and took our IDs and everything. And so I was court-martialed for that, but it was a minor court-martial, Article 15, where you're restricted to the post for 2 weeks. You have to do 2 hours extra duty a day for 15 days, they call it.
But no time in the stockade?
No time in the stockade. They call it 14-2. 14 hours of extra duty, 2 hours a day. In Germany, I didn't want to work as a clerk, so I asked if I could work with a dentist, and so I did. I worked in general dentistry with this German dentist who was very good, who had the the position on a German bomber as Don did on the B-17, and he was not very militaristic. He didn't like the military very much at that point.
What's the name of the base?
I was at Kaiserslautern, Germany. That's 50 miles from Heidelberg, and the troops called it K-Town. It means Kaiser's Lantern, Kaiserslautern. And I was there for a little under a year, and a friend of mine was a teacher in Illinois, and he was getting out and going back to teaching, and I realized that there was a shortage nationwide of 180,000 public school teachers, and I studied the Army regulations and knew them better than anybody ever has, I'm sure, and I learned that AR 235-205 paragraphs 4 and 10 provided early releases for people if their absence created a threat to the health, welfare, and security of the nation. So my argument was that since there was a shortage of 180,000 teachers, and he was able to get me a job teaching with him if I could get released from the Army, I put all that together in a request for early release, and the dumbasses above me would disapprove it and send it back, and I would send it back again and saying that elementary logic and common sense dictate that if you don't have the power to approve it, you don't have the power to disprove it either. And so after they did that twice, I sent it back in, and the final order was, it went through 5 different headquarters, and all of them, 4 of them were recommend disapproval, but the only one that had the authority to approve was Department of the Army in Washington, and the decision said, Private Scott will be returned to continental United States and separated on or before September 2nd, 1959. And people thought I had congressional influence to have all those recommend disapprovals and get it approved.
Maybe some kind of political influence at work.
That's what a lot of people thought, but it was just persistence and knowing the regulations and circumstances. And so I got out of the Army, and a friend named Jim Decker from LA, kind of rich Jewish kid, who...
Now you're back in Lubbock, or?
No, I didn't. I went to begin teaching in Round Lake, Illinois, 43 miles northeast of Chicago.
Yeah,
that's where I taught the first year, and 7th grade, and great experience because they let me teach the smartest kids out of 7th grade classrooms in all the basic subject areas, even though I had no experience. But it was a great time, and I found that my most brilliant students, in fact, they were such smart kids that at least 5 of them on competitive tests, scholastic aptitude tests, scored college level, even though they were 7th grade, and the median reading level of my class was 11th grade.
And what year was this?
59-60 school year. And and my friend taught the accelerated 8th grade class, and my students were smart and a little bit too confident. They said, well, let's challenge them to a spelling bee, and we did, and we beat them. The 7th grade class beat the 8th grade class. And I found that over the years, consistently, the most brilliant students in English were always the best spellers. You know, there are a lot of brilliant people who aren't good spellers because they're not motivated or not organized. But if people are good spellers, they're generally superior in all forms of English.
So where was your next assignment after that?
Well, then I went back to Lubbock and started at Texas Tech in the fall of 1960. School? That's where I met Grover. At Lubbock, I went into the master's program in English, and I had only 12 units of English because I had 57 units of foreign languages, but and I minored in political science at Tech, but I had only 12 units of English. And so I'd do some leveling, and I felt a little self-conscious about that. In fact, one day, and see, Grover went out of his way, my friend Grover Lewis, a brilliant journalist, and he wanted to be a writer even at that time.
There's your book right there.
Yeah.
As we talk.
This friend, Grover Lewis, that's where I met Grover in the fall of 1960 in an American Lit seminar. And when I first met him, I thought he was kind of a hopeless self-promoter because he was talking about all the literary awards that he'd won at North Texas University, where he'd met and befriended Larry McMurtry. And he said he'd been published in Nation magazine as an undergraduate, and I thought, who does this guy think he is? And, then later I got to know him, and I realized it's all true, and that he knew more about 20th century American literature than any combination of the professors that we had. And it's interesting because he went out of his way to befriend me for some reason, maybe because I spoke 3 languages at the time and had traveled in Europe and I'd studied in Mexico, worked in France in student programs, and served in the army in Germany. That came out in some of the discussions, and I guess Grover thought I was a little less provincial than some of the other students there. And so he was there in a doctoral program, NDEA fellowship, which provided not only full tuition and stipends, but he had enough money to pay for housing and his family expenses, and for himself, his wife, and their daughter, and then they had a son before he left there. He was there 3 years, and we became close friends then, and remained close friends until his death in around 35 years later.
So you got your master's, and then I keep trying to find out when you went into the Peace Corps.
Well, I finished the coursework and the master's thesis, and then I went in. I volunteered for the Peace Corps when I was teaching in El Paso for 1 semester. I didn't like graduate school very well. I thought it was kind of boring, and I had a much better experience as an undergraduate than a graduate student at Tech.
The Peace Corps doesn't pay very much.
No,
you know that.
No.
You're going to get to that.
No, I didn't go in to get rich. And so I volunteered. I had a chance I applied for 3 things in 1962 when I was teaching in El Paso. I applied for the doctoral program at Berkeley in comparative languages and literature, and I applied for an NDEA fellowship at San Francisco State to study Spanish and linguistics, and I volunteered for the Peace Corps. And I was accepted in 2 of the things. I didn't get accepted by the doctoral program at Berkeley, which is just as well, because you can't think of any more tedious life work than trying to become fluent in several languages, and where you have to to pass all kinds of thing. You have to become knowledgeable in the language and proficient proficient in the language and knowledgeable about the literature of several languages, and a lot of hard work.
I would think it would be hard to be admitted into graduate program at Berkeley.
That was an irony too, that when I applied, I didn't apply for any scholarship or fellowship, and then they sent me a letter saying, you are qualified for a scholarship or fellowship, so we would encourage you to apply, and I did, and then they didn't accept me into the program. But being, again, that would have, it was good that they didn't accept me into that program, because I don't think I would have survived. I would have seen that it took much, in fact, meeting Grover and seeing how brilliant he was in English, he knew very little about any other language. He spoke a little Spanish and maybe could read a little French or German, but he was really fluent only in English, and I decided that if you're relatively fluent in several languages, that's not going to leave you many opportunities to develop great depth in any one of them. So, I thought it would be better to be, that's why I decided to get the master's in English. And then when I years later, went into the doctoral program,
American Studies.
It was in American Studies. The primary areas were sociology and literature, which is a very interesting combination, I thought. And see, Grover was, he's one of the first ones who said, you shouldn't feel defensive in any way about not having all these hours in English, because he said, no intelligent person needs anybody else to tell him how to interpret literature or life. And I agree. In fact, Grover thought I was tougher physically than I am because of people like Chuck. He told Cal, another friend, Cal Robertson, I had a disagreement with one time. He said, old Rod sounds like a nice fella, but he's dangerous. And so Grover also thought I was better at languages than I am, and he also thought I was better at photography than I am.
So anyway, you went into the Peace Corps in Colombia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we were scheduled to go, we were selected to go to the Peace Corps in the Dominican Republic, but a few weeks before our Peace Corps training ended at Los Angeles State University, the Juan Bosch, a decent government in the Dominican Republic, he wasn't a communist or socialist, but he admired what was happening in Cuba, and he tried to replicate some of the enlightened programs from Cuba, and the CIA helped to overthrow him. So he was overthrown shortly before our training ended. So they extended our training and said to those of us who were supposed to go into teacher training, you're not needed in the Dominican Republic because the regime changed. So if you want to go to Colombia and work in educational television, you can do that. So that sounded interesting to me, and so they gave us a crash course, 14 hours a day for 2 weeks in educational television, and then sent us to Colombia. Of course, the Peace Corps was never great in really practical things like that, and so they really didn't need us. Most Peace Corps programs were in athletics or teaching English as a second language.
Yeah.
Not that many.
Or in Africa.
Water well drilling or things that people really needed. Although I have to say that the Peace Corps did one thing very important and useful, and that is, after 2 years of living in the host country, Peace Corps people see the world political scene much more from the perspective of the home country than the U.S. biased view of the world, the ethnocentric, imperialistic view that too many Americans have of the rest of the world.
You were there during the time they called La Violencia, correct?
Yeah, that's right. And, yeah,
what did that mean?
Well, in 1948, a very progressive and intelligent lawyer, he probably would have been the next president of the country, but the right-wing people assassinated him on the balcony in a big plaza in Bogota. His office had a balcony overlooking that plaza, and somebody killed him there. And then they had what they call the Bogotazo, where the left became violent and waging war against the people that they thought were responsible for his death. And so
They didn't have narco-terrorism at that time, I'm sure.
No. Medellin at that time was one of the business centers. In fact, they used to call Antioquia, the district that Medellin is in.
Yeah.
They said that's where they have Los Judíos de Colombia, the Jews of Colombia, because they were very good business people and very, very conservative. And so I taught at a university there, and I taught first at the University of Bogota, which was kind of conservative private university that
So
liked Nixon.
ESL? Or
In ESL, including composition. And so then they sent me to the National Women's University, which was a very good school. And it was you still see the Catholic influence because it was a state secular school, but they had crucifixes in every room, every classroom, and some of my students were nuns, even though it was a private women's university, the best women's university in the country. I was there, I taught until 65, and the saga of the Dominican Republic wasn't over, because in the spring of 1965, a leftist colonel named Camaño led an insurgency to overthrow the corrupt junta that had overthrown Juan Bosch. And then Johnson sent Marines and the 82nd Airborne to stop that rebellion. And one of my roommates was in Peace Corps training was a guy named Bob Zech, Z-E-C-H, he was the son of Lutheran missionaries in Puerto Rico, and he spoke fluent Spanish with a Puerto Rican accent. And he visited us in Colombia, and then he returned to Santo Domingo. And after Johnson sent the Marines in, I thought it was 10,000, but I read recently it's 42,000 Marines he sent with the 82nd Airborne, and a taxi driver in the capital saw these gringos in the back of a taxi, a couple, and then my friend Bob Zech, and he rammed the taxi and killed all three of them. And there were some other casualties too, because this guy I think his name was Steve Early, he didn't like my politics, and he used to call me a pinko during training, Peace Corps training. But he's a good example of people's attitude changing, because during that rebellion led to overthrow the military coup, some of the Peace Corps people, they were uniformly supporting the rebels. And this guy Early, who hadn't liked my politics, was a courier for the rebels. And I heard that he was so traumatized by all the death, and people like Zech was close, that he was a friend of Zech's as well, that he ended up with serious psychological problems as a result of that, and was institutionalized for a while. I don't know whatever happened to him after that.
Where were you the day that Kennedy was killed?
I was in El Paso. And I remember.
Well, that's before you went to Colombia then.
Yeah. Well, that was during the 2-week vacation that we got after Peace Corps training ended, and we.
Oh, okay.
And I got to go to Lubbock for a while, and then I flew to New York, and we flew out of the I guess it was LaGuardia.
LaGuardia.
And over in the other part of the waiting room at the airport was Burl Ives.
Oh.
I thought about going over to say how much I appreciated his work, but I thought he's probably got more than his share of fans badgering him, so I didn't say anything. After I was so disappointed in what happened in the Dominican Republic that Owen Lopez, a friend of mine who wasn't Peace Corps, he came down for, one of his friends was in the Peace Corps, and his friend John got married, and Owen Lopez came down for the wedding and stayed 18 months. And he and I organized a demonstration to protest the invasion of the Dominican Republic by Johnson in the spring of 1965. We picketed the U.S. Embassy, and then we joined a large demonstration at the National University. And I spoke. Owen didn't speak because my Spanish was better, so I spoke.
I thought he was Mexican and he spoke Spanish natively.
No, the irony, he's Black Irish.
Okay, that's right.
His father was one of the managers in the Manhattan Project in New Mexico, and his uncle was the richest rancher, a guy named Floyd Lee.
Santa Fe?
No, not Santa Fe, but I think it's San Mateo, Mexico, New Mexico, yeah. And so, if I hadn't had such a short time left, the State Department would have made the Peace Corps send me back. But then the cowardly press wouldn't identify us as Americans. If they'd identified us as Americans and me as Peace Corps, it would have made international press coverage.
Sure. So where did you go when you left the Peace Corps?
I went to Lubbock and got a job at Corning Community College just with my resume and a telephone interview. And I was there 2 years. And
didn't you apply to some other colleges though at the time, or? Well,
I applied to a black college in Texas. And I'm ashamed to admit there that they accepted me, but I thought they should have paid me a little higher salary than they were offering, so I didn't take it. And I've regretted that on many occasions, because I've never been that greedy about salary, and I've always been. But I got a fairly decent salary at Corning Community College, and met good people there, and was involved in the anti-war movement there in the mid-60s.
We're going to pick up where you went to Corning, New York, upstate New York.
Okay. Well, I learned about the job vacancy at Corning Community College. They were looking primarily for a Spanish teacher. I wanted to teach Spanish and English, and so I applied and sent a resume and got the job on the basis, full-time job on the basis of an interview by telephone and my resume. And so I ended up teaching 4 sections of Spanish, 2 of first year and 2 of second year, and then I taught an English composition class each term. And Corning was a beautiful area, nice, good people at the college. It was a kind of boring place to be in many ways if it hadn't been for the college, because it was more conservative than Texas, and it was a company town. The glass works and the college were the 2 major employers, and I ended up having some political battles there, because 2 friends of mine and I, in response to the local JCs circulating a petition, getting people to sign saying they supported Westmoreland. And so 3 of us, a guy named Derry Bennett, Tom French, and I, started circulating a petition saying if you really support the troops, the best way to show that is to bring them home from that miserable undeclared war. And we got a lot of bad press over that, and And I didn't have a telephone at the time and didn't want one. But
Looks like at this time you're becoming more politically active,
oh yeah, very active.
especially during the times.
Because it was very frustrating in Colombia to see Johnson intervening in the Dominican Republic in those years. 65 is the major escalation of troops in Vietnam. They grew to 500,000 by 1965 or late 65. And it was just so, I'd seen some examples of the State Department at work, and they were not very competent people, and it was my interpretation of the war that it was, the policy was by ethnocentric Americans who many times didn't know the language of or the culture of countries that we were intervening in, like Vietnam, and I thought it was outrageous that at one point when General Diem was installed in power, he was Catholic, and the Catholics represented about 15% of the Vietnamese population, and later the CIA assassinated him, which was not a bad thing politically, of course, not the kind of thing that this country should have been doing. We shouldn't have been intervening there to begin with, based on the domino theory that if some of the nations in Southeast Asia fell to communism, all the others would fall, would become communist in the same way. And so I was involved in anti-war activities, and one of the three people involved was Derry Bennett, and his wife Barbara used to get these threatening phone calls. People would call her up and say, "We're gonna beat up or kill your husband, and we're gonna kidnap your children." And
Wasn't he an ex-Navy SEAL?
yeah. In those years they didn't call them SEAL, General UDT.
Yeah, UDT.
Demolition Team.
Yeah.